Oh boy, I think I'm live now. Hello, everybody. It's Q here, and it is 2 p.m., November 17th, Tuesday, and I hope you are doing very, very well. It feels so good to finally publish some of the many ideas I have for this ongoing G2 components / WordPress components related project. If you haven't seen this yet, just go to g2components.wordpress.com, which is the public blog I have for this project where I continually give updates, share ideas, accompanying with some fun doodles that accompany some of these posts. This little guy here. And by the way, these ones are based on these doodles. They are based on the art style for this wonderful YouTube channel that I've followed for a very long time. Extra credits. And I did, in fact, get permission from them to use this art style for the material that I talk about. Originally, this was I had created a bunch of slides for a talk I gave at WordCamp US about design systems. That went very well, I think, and thankfully they were very, very kind in allowing me to use that art style, and I've kind of used it ever since. It's great because it's nice, it's simple, it's friendly. You're just drawing some rectangles and putting faces on them. It's awesome. And yeah, so in this blog post, I had shared basically a very rough outline, this kind of roadmappy thing that I made for the G2, how the G2 components will theoretically integrate into Gutenberg, the various tasks that we need to do, the sequences of them, and using this kind of medium, I sized the post-it task based on the estimated effort that it will take. The Miro, this was created on a Miro, and the board has updated a little bit. Just moving some things around, adding some new tasks, linking some things, but more importantly, taking some items off. Thank you so much, Sarah, for crushing some of these items. Thank you so much. So yeah, this post details the 4 phases that we'll have: prep, integration, build, and post-build. Yeah, there's a lot of detail that you can find within this post. But the reason why I'm streaming now, and the things that I would like to go over, is I would like to give some kind of overview and walkthrough for all of the various systems that exist within G2. Hopefully it'll give you a better sense of what these things are, how they relate to the components, and how they feed into this whole roadmappy thing. So in the beginning, from the very, very beginning, G2, I'm going to jump over to the repo, and we can see this little illustration I made long, long ago. G2 is intentionally composed of many systems. And these systems are important. They're responsible for various things, and they exist to kind of highlight the importance of various aspects within the component layer that makes up a application or a platform or anything else. These ones, some of them, they are maybe familiar if you've worked with kind of component libraries or systems before, like a style system, or perhaps you have something for animation. But what is unique for G2 is that it has what's called a context system right here. And I'll get into that a little bit later. And there are some other systems as well here, such as accessibility, and more recently, I'm going to jump into these ones. Wait, I have an annotation. I'm going to fire up my little tablet, because I think through drawing, so I need to do this. Great. Let's see. How do I fire up my annotation tool? Yeah. All right, cool. I can draw stuff on the screen. Great. So previously, there was a accessibility system, there was a animation system, and there was a gesture system that lived here. In addition to that, we have our context system, We have our style system, which is both there and create styles. This is a style system. We have our state management system for our components, which is Substate. And then we have our collection of utilities, which is just utils. So the reason why animation, accessibility, and gestures are no longer here. This was a change we made literally like an hour ago. Is because these systems or these packages basically were just re-exports of libraries. So the animation system is basically Framer Motion, which underneath the hood I believe is Pose, which has been now changed to Framer Motion. The the accessibility system is basically, gotta get rid of that annotation tool. Is basically Reakit, created by Diego Haas, a coworker of mine, very, very lovely fellow. And yeah, we're using this underneath the hood to handle a lot of the accessibility stuff, interaction coordination, ARIA handling, labeling, focus trapping, and all that wonderful stuff. And lastly, gestures. Gestures comes from React Use Gesture, which is a utility toolkit created by the lovely folks behind React Spring. And yeah, this is the gesture system that we're using within G2. And the reason why initially I created them as separate kind of dedicated packages was two reasons. One, I didn't know which libraries we were going to use for those layers, with the exception of Reakit. Like, I knew we were going to use Reakit from the very beginning. I didn't know what enhancements we may need to do for either animation or gestures to make it work better with the system. So for example, if I were to take a look at Substate is 98% basically a re-export of ZooStand. ZooStand is a state management system provided again by the lovely folks behind React Spring and the same folks behind React Use Gesture. The only difference is we are also exporting a special hook called Use Substate. Use Substate is basically just a re-export of the create store function from ZooStand, except it stores it as a reference, and using this particular implementation, it's a lot more friendly for component-based state management for a component library. So yeah, state management stuff. It's an interesting but a wild kind of thing to kind of get into. Let's see. Yeah, so those are the high levels of all of these various systems. The most important one, I would say, would be the style system. So I have a little map that I created maybe a couple of weeks ago. This is basically the breakdown of the main areas within G2. Yeah, I mean, the code for gestures and animation and accessibility still exists, but they're just no longer packages anymore. They are absorbed into wherever it is they need to be used, mostly within the components layer. So for styles, there is a thing inside that is quite unique. So let me see if I can draw this stuff out. Again, I communicate by drawing. Very visual person, and hopefully this makes sense. Let's see. Create new, and I can sure. Great and great. Cool. Zoom in. Bam bam. Use a pencil because I like my pencils for drawings. Drawing. Cool. Alrighty, so it's the style system. Fun fact, underneath the hood, style is actually created by a package, or I guess a subsystem or whatever it is you want to call it, called create style. So create style actually makes style. And style is a thing that powers components. Let's just write comps. Okay, so the reason why create style was kind of abstracted, largely it was to help separate and kind of clarify the custom stuff we need to do for the G2 components library in terms of styles. So what I mean is I'm going to dive into the code now, I guess. Let me see. Do I have the local storybooks fired up? No, I don't. So while that is building, what you're seeing here, this is the code for the G2 components package, which I guess I'll dive into. But the most important thing is underneath the hood of Create Styles. I'm going to move all this. V, move to the center-ish area. Great. Brush. All right. So underneath the hood, Create Styles ultimately uses Emotion for its kind of CSS compiler. In Emotion, this is important. This is V10, and the reason why I say V10 is because V11 recently came out. So underneath the hood, oh dang. Underneath the hood, Emotion uses something called Stylus as its kind of compiler, CSS compiler thingy. So that goes inside of here, that goes inside of here. And this one is they use their, at least for V10, they use their own kind of Emotion Stylus thing, which is based on V3. Emotion V11 uses V4 of Stylus, which is now completely different. So we are actually not using Emotion straight up underneath the hood, and there are many, many different reasons for that. Largely, it comes down to we need the CSS to compile in a very specific way so that the styles are 97, 98, or 99% guaranteed to work in a WordPress Gutenberg environment out of the hood with no conflict. This is an incredible challenge for any CSS and JS or any CSS solution. It doesn't matter if it's JavaScript powered or if you're using something that's kind of like pre-built. It doesn't matter if you're using Post CSS or if you're using something like Tailwind or if you're using something like Bootstrap. It doesn't really matter. The challenge with CSS in trying to integrate something like that in a existing environment where styles are that exists within the ecosystem or the environment is older than the solution that you're using to implement this stuff. For example, there's styles that exist within WordPress that's probably older than Sass itself, and so on. The styles that accompany these components, they somehow have to work in that environment. A lot of these libraries, these systems like CSS, any kind of CSS JS thing you can think of, from the older kind of probably now deprecated Glamorous to Emotion to styled components to Lunaria to Treat to anything that you can think of. They are largely kind of built, at least out of the box, to work for brand new-ish, mostly React dedicated projects. On top of that, they are just hopefully the project or application you're building this stuff for, you have almost 100% control of all the UI, the styles, and the code and everything that renders there. This is absolutely not the case for Gutenberg or WordPress. Gutenberg it's a combination of a WordPress powered thing, which is the editor itself, but then also it has to accommodate things that are coming from the PHP side and also styles that are coming from a third-party theme, right? Like you can install any kind of WordPress theme, and the editor essentially has no control over that, with the exception of some best practices and fingers crossed that your theme kind of follows these conventions. On top of that, there's also third-party plugins and all that stuff that could be enabled that inject their own styles that may or may not conflict with whatever the heck you have there. So yeah, lots of unpredictability within the WordPress Gutenberg space. It makes a challenge very, very, very difficult, but not impossible. So in recognizing all that, we needed a style solution that could work with this environment or any other environment, but definitely this environment, that worked out of the box with hopefully basically zero configuration needed for the Gutenberg project, and definitely zero anything required from third-party developers. That is important. This whole thing, we want this whole G2 thing, this UI stuff, we want to create something, this elevated and improved experience that makes it easier for developers and designers to work with, not stuff that involves them having to like rig up Webpack and do whatever the case. No. We can't do that. So jumping into just very, I'll just open this in a dedicated kind of iframe. So if I were to take a look at these styles, right, and zoom in a little bit, there are some things that's interesting. It's automatically kind of interesting. So if we take a look at these compiled style names, or selectors, sorry. Sure, you have the hashed, unique, CSS hyphen whatever, which is what you would get from a styled components from an emotion or anything else like that. But the difference is that this is compounded by default, I believe, 7 times. And the reason why it's compounded is because, and it's done automatically, by the way, it's to elevate the specificity for these styles to reduce the chances of this even further from conflicting with anything that exists within the Gutenberg and WordPress system. So if I take a look at, say, the Gutenberg environment right now, this is, I believe, the latest and greatest as published within Gutenberg. And if I were to take a look at, I don't know, anything here, right? This input, for example, the styles for our G2 input has to basically contend and fight with whatever styles that exist here. So here we have an arbitrary kind of global input text-based selector, which is not assigned to any class whatsoever, that does some padding stuff, min height stuff, line height stuff, sure, and some additional styles. And in addition to that, we have some arbitrary, what is this, universal selector for the sidebar that does something with box sizing, I don't know. And yeah, and it continues, right? All these styles are kind of come from all over the place, hopefully largely from the Gutenberg editor and not so much from themes and plugins, but again, we can't predict that. So yeah, it has to contend with all this stuff. This one's actually quite tame, I think. I've seen some other ones where it's sort of like the first div or something, like a first element of something else, where it uses those crocodile things, and it kind of compounds in that manner. So we need styles that work out of the box, that can contend with these things and hopefully win the specificity wars so that they render reliably without, here's the important part, they render reliably without affecting anything else in this environment. So what I mean by that is, for certain kind of component-based libraries or frameworks, Bootstrap's a great example. They rely on some sort of global reset to prep all the components that may render from that specific framework. So Bootstrap has Bootstrap Reset, which I believe does things like box sizing, border box for everything, and a bunch of input things, and whatever the case may be. Like, we can't do that for G2. Just because we don't want to introduce any kind of potential side effects to the styles that may exist here already. So these have to be self-contained styles that work out of the box. That's one. And number 2 is that they can't affect anything that lives within this environment. With all that being said, right, like that's the absolute bare minimum requirement we have to have for this style system. And because emotion and anything else that you can think of doesn't support something like that out of the box, we basically had to create our own using emotion as the foundation. So instead of using the emotion package, we're actually using something called create emotion. In create emotion, you basically use this function to create your own custom emotion instance, which has a bunch of things associated with it. It has, it has what they call a cache, which is a lot of the memory of like all the styles that's rendered. It has a CSS function, it has a CX function, which is their dedicated kind of class name resolver thing. It has a bunch of other things in there, but cache is the main. Oh yeah, it has stuff like inject global for global style-y kind of injection stuff, but that's a bunch of other things. But the main things that we need are cache, CSS, and CX. And to make this a little bit more interesting going forward as well, the place where G2 kind of differs from emotions and styled components and stuff is its strategy around theming. So I'm just going to write this in here. Oh yeah, you also get like a theme provider and all that kind of stuff as well. So theming. What I mean by theming, I don't necessarily mean like theming as in the WordPress kind of site theming thing. For component libraries, theming is just generally you're introducing several variables or whatever the case may be. Emotion theming that allow you to modify components in sort of like a app-wide way, right? So in this kind of example, you have a theme object that has a background color and a color, and wherever it is you're establishing your emotion kind of custom styles, you're able to tap into that theme data, and you're able to use those theme properties in whatever it is you need. In this case, we've created a theme with the colors of primary being hot pink, and let me zoom in a little bit. And for this some text component thing, we're just grabbing that value to render as a color, and that's what you're seeing here. So the strategy that emotion, styled components, and everything else uses for their theming is context. They're using React context effectively to handle all of this. And with context, you need some sort of provider of some kind, and you need to hook into that provider either with consumers, being a context consumer, which isn't as popular these days, or with hooks, which is kind of like the go-to solution now. But yeah, so you basically have a system with some sort of root level provider, and you have every single kind of styled component thing that you can think of being rigged up to that provider. So where G2 differs is its theming actually does not use context whatsoever. It uses CSS variables. And the reason for that is that, mostly it's for performance reasons. So with context, anytime any of these values need to change, right? You're adjusting the primary color for something else for reasons. React has to walk through the entire tree of all of your components that may be rigged up to this context system and resolve them, right? Like, I notice you're using the primary color of red. It's blue now, so that one needs to re-render, and so on and so on and so on. Walk down and walk up the entire thing. But if you're using CSS variables, you're effectively using the CSS engine within your browser to handle all of that. React and JavaScript have nothing to kind of do with that. So that's really, really great from a performance standpoint. So because we're using the CSS variable strategy instead of the traditional context-based strategy, we had to create a system around that. So I wrote a blog post about this in the G2 components repo, the website. And this basically comes down to, if I were to boil this down, it comes to a collection of configs and getter functions for those configs. So if I were to jump into the code within G2 components, styles, config, right. All of the variables or design tokens or configs or whatever it is you want to call them, right? Key value pairs, essentially, that have to do with style values. All of them live in this kind of master config.js file. And they range from colors to text to fonts to control things to button properties and so on. Everything lives here. And ultimately, this stuff, what you're seeing, like camel-cased things with this special get function or whatever, they ultimately get compiled down into CSS variables that look like this. var, wpg2, whatever the case may be. And this is important, and now we're touching into this get function. This is important because we're not referencing the value of the variables directly, right? These values map to whatever this thing is, right? But we're not doing like var hyphen whatever the case may be. The reason for that is that it makes it easier in case we need to modify any names for these variables. That's one. The other one is that this get function, right, instead of just writing it as a string, this get function, if I were to jump into, say, styles.whatever, because it's a function and we can type it, the developer experience of this is greatly improved. So if I were to type in get and some string thing, we can see that it provides us with a collection of all of our design tokens here. And we can just access them like this. And every time you add a new design token to here, it automatically is available throughout your code base. And that's how this can scale and grow in a kind of nice organic way. So all this to say, like that combined together ultimately compiles down to CSS variables that somehow need to be injected into the root. So here's the other thing. So if I were to jump back into here, right? Theming. If for theming, for the traditional sense, if you were to use something that's context-based, you need some sort of root provider somewhere that lives app level, and then you put all your stuff inside. G2 actually doesn't require you to do that. All of these variables that you're seeing here, they are actually injected by themselves the moment just before the very first G2 component renders. They're automatically injected, so no provider is required. That makes it much nicer from a developer kind of experience, because then there's one less thing you need to rig up. There's one less thing you need to do. It just kind of works and is taken care of for you. Let me just show you real fast how that works. How on earth does that work? So, create styles, create compiler, and blah, blah. There's a hooks or something somewhere, and hooks, and there we go. So there is a special hook that gets fired right before the layout renders that for one time it globally injects all the variables that the system needs to function. That's the base CSS variables and also the various variables for its various modes, like dark mode, high contrast mode, and dark high contrast mode. So, G2 has dark mode and stuff built in, by the way. So if I were to say go here, and if I were to switch to dark mode, we have dark mode, and all of that is handled via CSS variables. And so if I were to use the context-based strategy to do this, then effectively what needs to happen is the context, the React render reconciler has to walk through all the variables that all the components that you've rendered within your application and flip them to dark mode to force them to use the dark mode style and then walk back out again. So you can imagine for a larger application, maybe something that's very, very complex in terms of how many UI bits they have to render, that can be quite expensive. From an execution standpoint. But for here, we're actually not doing anything with the exception, if you can check out this HTML attribute here. We're just flipping this value from light to dark. And The CSS variables, they've already been injected here, they've already been precompiled, and the browser then takes care of the rest. So yeah, that's a big difference in terms of how theming is handled between G2 and the traditional emotion and styled components setup. And this little thing is important and very, very fundamental to the entire project. And that's where I think a lot of the complexity lies within this thing, because it's so kind of custom, right? And I think because of that, that's why I've kind of migrated all of the kind of rendery, compile-y, all that stuff into something called Create Styles, which is effectively a factory that you can use to create a styled system. So if you want to, you can actually use this to create your own style system that can live alongside G2 or alongside your project or whatever the case may be. The G2 style system, if I go to the styles directory right here, all it does is that it uses create style to create its own style system. So if I were to go into here, yeah, I'm just creating a style system, right? Which gives me a bunch of things like the compiler, which is the emotion stuff. We have the getter function. We have styled, which is how you can create styled components within G2. Very, very similar to like if you were to do styled backtick and like background red or something like that. You get that with this create style system. And oh yeah, the other cool thing that you can do is you can define what base styles you would like for your style system. So in this case, I have every single component that is rendered through this style system automatically has a font family of some kind, a font size of some kind, font smoothing is applied, and also margin is zeroed, right? And this is how you can kind of normalize styles from a very, very base level rather than relying on some sort of global reset or anything like that. So the create style system has kind of taken care of that for us, which is lovely. And yeah, that's a high level / in-depth overview of the uniqueness that is the create style system. And one final thing, since I mentioned the CSS variables and all that kind of stuff, one thing that we have to do within G2 is that we need to support IE11. At least that's, from my knowledge, we need to support IE11. And CSS variables don't work within IE11, which is unfortunate. So we need some sort of way for these components, again, to be able to handle CSS variable rendering automatically without having to do anything. If you're using a more traditional pre-processing based workflow like a Sass or anything else, right? You have the ability to tap into post CSS. And with post CSS, you have plugins that you can add like auto prefixing, but then also CSS variable handling. So when Webpack or whatever does its thing, right? It compiles all your styles. Post CSS will automatically find your variables and inject fallbacks and whatever it is for you. Us in the front end, just in time compiled CSS and JS world, we don't have that luxury. We don't have post CSS there to kind of handle that for us for the just in time compiled styles. So we need to handle CSS variables in some way. So remember how I showed that we have selector compounding to the power of 7. That's tapping into, if I jump back to Photoshop for a second. Alrighty, Stylus. So the cool thing with Stylus is that it provides us with a plugin layer. For V4, I believe that it's called middleware now, but for V3, they're called plugins. So we've actually written custom plugins that tap into the Stylus kind of compile-y, rendery engine thingy for selector compounding. I forgot what I called it. I think I called it like extra specificity. I'm just going to call it extra selector for now. selector compounding, but then also CSS variables are here. We have a special plugin for CSS variables. Oh man, I'm so glad we were able to solve this one. This was solved maybe 2 weeks ago. I had some sort of plugin early-ish on within G2, but it ended up not. Only worked kind of 50% of the time. Reason IE11 not supported JavaScript API, complicated things. Anywho, but yeah, we solved this one recently, which is great. And the other one that we have yet to kind of finalize is right to left handling, right? But anywho, all of these guys can tap into the plugin layer for Stylus so that any styles that are that's compiled with emotion automatically gets style selector compounding, automatically gets a CSS variable kind of fallback handling, and automatically can handle right to left depending on the environment that you currently have in your browser. So if I were to take a look at this code here, font size. So you can see that there is, it's using a CSS variable reference, but we can see that there is font size 13 here, and that is a fallback. So IE11 would recognize this one here. It wouldn't recognize this one. So with that, we have IE11 handling automatically, which is awesome. Not only that, for the G2 components, because this exists in the style layer, in the style system layer. Any custom styles you write beyond G2 components, assuming you're using the style system in some kind, right? Either you're customizing CSS on top of the G2 components, or you're using parts of the style system to write new styles. You automatically are tapped into this system, these plugins for free. You get CSS variable handling, you get selector compounding, and you get right to left handling, assuming we get that in, for free. And yeah, all this stuff that I'm talking about here, this plugin layer, this CSS variable handling, the CSS variable strategy versus context, that's why we needed to create our own kind of emotion kind of instance rather than using emotion underneath the hood. There's also some other benefits as well, and this one also kind of gets into the details. But early on within G2, when I was researching various kind of frameworks and strategies and stuff for designing and creating component libraries and systems and so on, this of course came into my radar. And originally Theme UI was powering G2. Like this was actually part of the early G2, but it has since been removed. But there are a lot of things from here that I did enjoy, that made its way into the G2 that we have today. That is, let me see. Where is it? Responsive styles. Yeah. I felt like this was a lovely, lovely API here. So I'm going to jump into VS Code and write this real fast. So the thing that you can do with, the thing that you can do with styled systems or theme UI, which use a style system underneath the hood, is let's say they have a box component, right? Box is basically their most bare level component that they have in the system, and everything is built on top of box. G2 has one as well. It's called View, which does the same thing. So their basic box component, which is basically a smarter and glorified div, you can pass in something called SX, which is a custom styles. And it accepts a string or interpolated string or an object. Well, let's just use an object for now. So you can do something like this. For any kind of CSS property, you can provide the property with an array. And what this array maps to is that it maps to the system's internal kind of breakpoints for its responsive styles. In this case, we have mobile, tablet, and desktop. And my goodness, like, if you didn't have this, you'd essentially have to write custom CSS styles, whether it's whether you're using JavaScript to kind of target media queries or using media queries through some CSS and JS thing, or whatever the case may be. You have to write some sort of inline custom CSS kind of stuff to handle this. But with this built as part of the fundamental piece of the system, you can just tap into this, provide an array with the understanding that this is what it does, and it just magically handles media query responsive rendering for you. And I felt like this was such a brilliant and elegantly designed API, and that's something I just had to have for the G2 system. And basically what I did was, let's write the theme UI here. So we have, it was theme UI. And theme UI, I'm going to make this a little darker. One moment. So we had theme UI. And theme UI, underneath the hood, it uses styled systems. I'm just going to write styled sys. Right. So we actually didn't use theme UI or styled system, but there were some things we borrowed from it. So for example, responsive, which is the thing I just talked about, the magic array mapped to media query kind of rendering thing. So we borrowed responsive from theme UI and styled systems to make it into the create styles package, because it's such a cool feature. All right, jumping back to my mouse. Yeah. I think that's what I had to say about that. I think that wraps up the intricacies and the complexities that is the Create Styles package. It's basically a mishmash of all the best things that I've encountered, from styled systems, theme UI, emotion, styled components, everything else. Oh yeah, another one I drew inspiration from, and this one's from Atlassian, compiled. Compiled, yeah. And I think I got the CSS variable idea from them, because compiled, what it does is it basically creates CSS variables for any kind of interpolated logic-based thing you may have in your styled components. So for example, if you did something like this, underneath the hood, it will compile down to CSS variables like this, and it'll swap between the two based on whatever values you have. Anywho, yeah, I drew the inspiration from the best from all these different libraries, combined them together, and massaged it in a way that would work within the WordPress Gutenberg environment. And that's what creates styles, and ultimately that's what the style system is within G2. Oh, what a journey that was. One moment as I take a sip. Take a sip of coffee. Oh dear. Hopefully you were able to follow that so far. So we've migrated now, in terms of all the stuff we're talking about. We've migrated from create styles. So I guess we have a fundamental understanding, I guess, of what create style is, why it exists, what it supports, like plugin layer, like taking the best from things like styled systems and theme UI, and doing alternate theme rendering strategy using CSS variables instead of context, and so on, and ultimately creating this factory thing called create style, which is then used to create the style system, which is then ultimately used to render all the components within G2. So one fundamental thing that G2 style system has that shares with some other more modern component libraries of today is that it has some sort of fundamental kind of box component. Write this in quotes. We have box. G2 actually, instead of box, it uses view. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Same thing, glorified div with a bunch of things built in. So if you were to take at frameworks like Chakra UI, which recently released version 1, congrats to them, by the way. Theme UI, perhaps Segment's Evergreen, Uber's Base, and a couple of other ones. It's a very common thing now. Oh, RiaKit, of course. RiaKit also has a box component. If you take a look at any of them, all of them have some sort of singular base glorified div component known as a box. And the reason why this is important is because it should, at least for these component libraries, it is automatically rigged up into the style system of that given library. So in the case of G2, if I were to jump into my code examples, right, everything within G2, or 99% of the things, ultimately uses what G2 refers to a view underneath the hood. And the cool thing about view is that it has a special CSS property that you can give it. And this was largely inspired by both emotion and styled UI. The difference, though, is that those strategies require you to do something at the very top. I believe, I can't remember what it is exactly. Something like JSX, Pragma, something. We can Google this. I don't know. You have to declare some sort of alternate JSX compiler thingy at the very top so that it understands how to use the CSS property. But what that enables essentially is it allows you to write inline styles in this manner. So if I were to write background red like that, what this compiles down to isn't this, which is what you may expect. It actually compiles down to something like this. Mumbo jumbo, right? This runs through the same compiler like any styles that you would write within the G2 style ecosystem. And it is pre-bound to the div, which is what this view is, and it provides it with the class name of that. And the cool thing about this, and again, because it's using something like Stylus underneath the hood, is you can do something that is literally impossible with inline styles, and that is you can use pseudos. And you can do something, if you're familiar with the Sass-based workflow, then we have the lovely ampersand that we can use to do compounded combined styles. So if I were to do @hover, background blue, right? The CSS compiler knows how to do its thing, and I mean, this value changes to something else. But now this div, if you hover your mouse over it, it knows how to change its background to blue because you passed it inside of here. So yeah, so the view, the biggest benefit of the view is that it gives you the ability to modify styles in an inline way while respecting the architecture and the best practices of the style system that you're working with. Because a lot of from what I've observed and from my experience, a lot of fragmentation, uncontrolled fragmentation that inevitably will be tech debt, exists from one-off based customizations that you had to create because the system that you're working with could not accommodate you. So if you needed to render, say, if you needed to render, say, a input, right, like this, with a kind of specific width next to this reset button, and you had some selector thingy here, a select thingy here, right? What happens a lot right now within Gutenberg, and I'm sure other code bases as well, if there isn't a layout-based component that allows you to do that, you basically have to write custom CSS. Where do you write custom CSS? Most likely in a Sass file somewhere, you give it some custom class names, and those styles kind of have to live forever. So now you have something like, I don't know, what is this? Typography controls wrapper with a grid, a display of grid, and maybe a template columns of grid template columns of blah blah blah, and then you have like specific numbers like 87 pixels for reasons and whatever the case may be. it would be a lot better if you had something like this. So let's say we had a select, right? Just very quickly pseudocoding. We had a button, and you'd had just this. And you had your grid template columns of blah, blah, and it exists inside of here. Sure, it's not the nicest thing to take a look at, right? It's be nicer if this code didn't feel like inline styles, which is, you can totally do that, but with G2 you can actually do something like this. Const, I don't know, let's call it control wrapper, sure. And you can do this. So if you wanted to, you can just do that, which is very much the same as if you were to write custom styles with CSS and you pass it a class name. Yeah, it's much nicer when it exists like this, because then it exists within the same scope, it's controlled, it's still tapped into the same style system as everything else, so they know how to play with each other, right? They are aware of each other. But ideally, what you want is you'd want like kind of layout components where you didn't have to write custom styles at all. But I know that it's impossible, especially in such a dynamic and open platform like WordPress and Gutenberg. It's impossible to avoid writing custom styles, right? You're creating custom interfaces that may need bespoke styles for reasons. That's one. Or you may be intentionally modifying the aesthetics of the UI to better fit your plugin or your company's branding for reasons. You need to write custom styles in some way. So the system should know that and it should be able to accommodate that. And G2's style system has various ways of doing that, from the way that it can do theming, globalized theming, to basically fine-tune and adjust whatever properties you may need, to doing inline styles in this kind of way that still, again, respects the entire style system. Yeah, that's why the view the view component is so important and is the fundamental thing that powers that powers basically all the UI that's rendered within WordPress components. Not WordPress components, sorry, G2 components. What am I trying to do? There we go. I'm still trying to get used to this Photoshop. Oh my goodness, these Photoshop hotkeys. Prior to this, I've mostly done my digital drawing with an iPad in Procreate with an Apple Pencil. And I've only just recently come back into drawing with a Wacom thingy inside of Photoshop. So excuse my fiddling with hotkeys. Great. So we now understand that everything is built within the view. That's cool. So the other thing within the style layer, we're not in the style system anymore. Sorry, we're not in the create styles factory. We're in the styles layer, D2, is something that came a little bit later during the development, but again has been fundamental to the whole G2 experience, and that is the collection of presets. So if I were to jump into, say, the button styles right here, zoom out a little bit, we can see, in addition to CSS, which is the fancified version of the emotion CSS function that we can get from the styles package, we also have something called UI. What UI is it's basically a collection of all the kind of mix-ins and presets and things like that that you would need to write styles with G2 in a way that has been certified by the system. So what I mean by that is, like, if you imagine Sass. Oh, hey Lynn, hope you're doing well. So if you know Sass, you have your mix-ins, your functions, or whatever, and they live kind of somewhere, right? And because of how Sass works, those functions and mix-ins are then globally available somewhere, and you can just kind of abstractly and arbitrarily use them in places. And it's very difficult to know what those things are, know what they do, without you being either super familiar with the code base or having some documentation that you would have to constantly refer to. So with UI, all of those mix-ins and presets and stuff, if you're using something like VS Code, you have IntelliSense auto-completion, so you have access to all of these presets and stuff right here. And with this, you have the infamous get function that allows you to get any kind of design token within the style system. You also have access to some other things that is really, really nice. So for example, UI, you can do this. UI, background, and you can specify a background color, like red, for example. And if you're to write this as either an inline kind of style within your CSS stuff or as a thing within your within here. So if you did something like this, right, you brought in UI dot background is red, which ultimately compiles down to a style. So the reason why this one is important is because I'm going to jump over to the storybook now. In addition to rendering the approved red background for G2, it has colorblind support built in. So if I were to turn colorblind mode on, if you were to see green, red, and yellow, hopefully you can see this, there is custom patterns for this. And this was inspired, I was inspired by this from Trello long ago. They did this with their tags, and I thought this was brilliant. And I actually had a colorblind coworker that confirmed that like it was super helpful for them, and that kind of stuck with me ever since. So I know it is cool, right, Lynn? Yeah, so it's not just a background color. There's like background patterns and whatever the case may be that needs to render something like that. So if I were to jump to the CSS, if I were to, look at all this nonsense. Not nonsense, but like look at all that stuff that needs to happen for this to work. And it taps into the variable system, of course, and blah, blah, blah. But like, instead of you having to write all this, you can just use this, which is effectively the same thing as a Sass mixin if you were to use like, I don't know, background red or something like that. So yeah, all of that is available to you from this collection of stuff from the UI object that comes from the style system. And there's a bunch of other things in here that's really cool. Hey, Fabian, so nice of you to join. And what's cool about this, and the reason why it kind of came a little bit later, was I was actually learning Swift UI from this website. Highly recommend, by the way. I'm not affiliated or sponsored by them. Just have a lot of respect for these folks. By the way, the person who created this, I don't know if you know, back in the day, in the early days of DeviantArt and so on, they had a website called shadowness.com. So the person who created that made this. I thought that was really cool. Anywho, I picked up a course from them, learned some basics of Swift UI, and man, I can't build a lot of things with Swift UI, but learning it opened my eyes to like how nice a development environment or development workflow could be. And a lot of Swift UI stuff is they have a lot of kind of built-in functions that kind of make things easier for you. And I wanted to bring that experience into G2 via this UI object. So with this UI object, some things that you can do is like UI dot, let's see. Oh yeah, this is kind of neat. So if you had some custom styles like this, right, and you wanted to just target, I don't know, Firefox, right? You can actually do that with this. So now if you write the styles here, background red, this is Firefox only now. So this kind of came later because there was a bug in Firefox or Safari or something that needed to fix. So I just created a collection of like browser specific things that you can target with this guy. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, there is a Z-index system within G2. So you can write your custom Z indexes here like that, or you can tap into pre-registered values. So if you had modals, for example, right, you can tap into the modal value, or you can create your own. So if I did 1, 2, 3, custom modal, let's say in whatever you're working with right now, you're creating custom modals or whatever the case may be for your plugin, your third-party block, or whatever. So you could say, oh yeah, just use this custom modal and have a fallback of 1, 2, 3. So everywhere else in your code base, you now have access to this custom modal thing, Z-index namespace. So that's what Z-index is. It's kind of cool. One last example. Let's see. Oh, this is my favorite. Animation. And again, this is very, very much heavily inspired by SwiftUI. Let's see if I can jump to the live docs. That gives that's the best example I can show for animation and the power of these collections of presets. It was elevation. Yeah. All right. Cool. Check this out. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. Hopefully you can see. This is a live code thing, by the way. So if I were to change into the no exclamation mark, you can see that it renders here. So yeah, we're now familiar with the style system. We're familiar with the view. We're familiar with this inline CSS thing that knows how to do like inline compiling, and that's kind of cool. Let's do some fun with UI. Let's use UI and have some fun. So, like I said earlier, what you can do is you can do something like, I don't know, let's make it a background of blue. Oh no, it's not applying to the card. That's okay. The card is, the surface, sorry. Surface, by the way, it's a lower-level component within G2 that's responsible for rendering the background, which is important because it knows how to support things like dark mode, for example. So when we switch over to dark mode, we're not blanketly applying whatever this color is, 111, to everything. We're only applying it to the surfaces of things. And that's used in cards and everything that you can think of that needs to be dark or light. That's what surface is. Anywho, jumping into... So if you haven't caught one of these streams before, sometimes I go into these weird tangents where I go like really in depth into something and I'll come back out, which is what I just did. Yeah, let's make this background blue, right? And the thing that you can do with UI is that it has kind of interactions that you can use. So if I did UI hover, which is a function, and if I were to give it UI background red, let's see if it works. Oh. Yeah, so now if I hover over this thing, it becomes red. What else can we do? Maybe when we hover, we want to make it bigger as well. So we can scale. I believe it's a function. Yeah, well, it's kind of cut off, but hopefully, well, hang on, I'll just shrink it to begin with. So let's do UI scale 0.6, something like that. And now when you hover over it, it turns really big, right? So what's cool about this, again, if you're using something like VS Code, you have IntelliSense support. So it tells you with inline docs and stuff, like what values it expects and so on. So it's a little bit of a nicer experience than me trying to blindly do it here. But anywho, so now if I hover over this thing, we can get a scale of 1.1 with a default scale of 0.6. And we just wrote this all in line. And this is very fun to kind of prototype and like play around with interactions and stuff, by the way. And again, this is like impossible to do with inline styles, which is why the CSS property is so powerful. But here is where it gets fun. Let's also animate this. So what you can do is if you need animations, all you got to do is type UI animation. Hang on, I need autocompletion. Yeah, animation. And there is a collection of animations that you can apply. Let's see if I can get it to show. Yeah. There is default, which is a default animation. You can change some of the easing things. So ease in or ease out. And then there is, I think, bounce. Bounce, a fun one. But anyway, I'll just do default. So just by writing that, right, we can see we've applied animations to this thing. How cool. I think it's really cool. And let's do another thing where like if you click it, which is active, right? Let's change the background to yellow. And let's make it the scale 1.5. Click. Yeah. Click, 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 click. Oh, that's so cool. And there's another one you can do bounce, which has a little bit of a spring to it, right? Click, bounce. And yeah, and you just by using this inline CSS property and using this UI and kind of just using UI with mix-ins and values and stuff that the system has pre-approved for you and has hopefully simplified for you, you're able to create experiences like this very, very easily. And again, this all taps into the same style system, so whatever you've written here, the entirety of G2 will know how to understand it. And they won't fight with each other because this is using the same style system underneath the hood. So yeah. I remember the day that I got this to work. I was just so giddy. Just because of like what this reminds me of a lot is it reminds me of the feeling I had when I was learning and using jQuery for the first time. So many years ago, this is my little tangent now. When I started learning development, I'm actually a designer first, and then I started learning code things later. So many years ago, when I was just starting to learn code and JavaScript and so on, I couldn't really get my head around code. Like PHP, I couldn't even. Some JavaScript examples that I saw with like for loops and all this, like whatever while loops and whatever, like I couldn't get hoisting. I couldn't get my head around that. But jQuery made it accessible for me, just like how I was able to understand CSS. And from that, like I felt very empowered to be able to build such wonderful experiences by basically not really knowing how to code. But through jQuery, I eventually learned how to code and eventually learn like the basic JavaScript and kind of built from there. I worked backwards as I typically do with any other programming language or whatever it is I picked up. But how jQuery kind of simplified things into these easy to read, easy to understand, which is subjective, easy to understand APIs and code, it unlocked this for me. And this is something that hopefully I'm trying to carry forward within the context of G2 components, because I want folks to be able to build rich experiences in a way that feels easy and intuitive, and also in a way that doesn't shoot themselves in the foot with however it is the code is compiled. They shouldn't have to think about code compile order or specificity or class names or any of this stuff just to kind of get their animations to bounce. It should just kind of work, and the system should be there to provide that for them. And I think with that in mind, people of all experience levels, whether you're just prototyping something real fast just to play around with, or you're building something serious, not serious, but like something a little bit more substantial within the context of Gutenberg and whatever, you should be able to build richer experiences. And hopefully that's what I'm hoping, richer experiences that are consistent with the entire UI experience that is WordPress and Gutenberg. And that fundamental kind of philosophy is what I had from the very beginning in constructing and designing and imagining G2. Like I wanted to unlock and enable this. That's a long story of why this UI layer exists, because it has built-in functions that allow you to play with things. So yeah, that's a UI is a big part of the style system. I'm gonna write this here. UI, yay. Which is a unique thing inside of as far as style systems and CSS and JSS goes. Like you don't get this with Emotion or anything else. This was a very deliberate thing that was built and added for G2. And just personally, like, it's helped tremendously in the development of this stuff. Like, you can see it everywhere within the G2 code base. So if I were to just do a command search for UI dot something, you will see it, whether it's padding or the get function or scaling or whatever. Space. Oh yeah, space. That's a big one. So space taps into the grid system of G2. And I had mentioned very earlier in this stream that G2 is a system that's built upon many systems. So in addition to the color system and let's see, z-index system, there is a system for grids and spacing. So if I were to do something like const a equals UI dot space 2, sure, or 3, or 2, yeah, let's go with this example. By default, like what this eventually compiles down to isn't necessarily 8 pixels, it'll compute to 8 pixels. But what it actually compiles down to is something that looks like, if I can find an example, this one, yeah. It compiles down to something that looks like this, which is a CSS variable that taps into the grid system and blah, 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 but eventually it computes down to 8 pixels. So the idea of space, this very specific preset or mixin, is that it encourages users, by users I mean other developers, to do the right thing. Please use our spacing and grid system to build things so that everything looks and feels consistent and cohesive. So with this, if I need a value like a margin or a padding or something, I'll give it a space of 2. Then it'll render 2 will be a multiplier that'll render against the grid system. And because ultimately it's a CSS variable, if you choose, by you I mean again you because this theming system is open for modification, you can adjust any value you want within the G2 ecosystem. So a great example is right now I have a collection of various themes that I can apply to the UI. So if I were to jump to, what's a good example? Let's say these typography tools. Here, yeah. So right now I've just switched over to base. Base is the default UI that we're going to be delivering hopefully into Gutenberg, and this is designed to make it look as Gutenbergy as possible. We have what's called next. These next styles are the styles that we're currently iterating on and designing on, and this is the imagining of like, oh, this is kind of where we want, this is the direction we want to take things into. And we have some other fun styles. So Blueberry. Blueberry is actually the initial styles I had for G2. And this was based very much on the latest Mac and iOS kind of interface, and also interfaces from websites like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so on. Anywho, theming system. You're able to adjust any values you want. And if you wanted to, you can adjust what the base default grid value is. By default is 4. But for reasons, if you need 3 or a base of 5, you can do that. And because everything uses the space preset, hopefully, it'll know how to scale and grow with the values that you've given it. So with space being a thing, if I needed something to do with padding, right? Padding, so right now I'm applying padding to all sides, and this value of 2 isn't necessarily 2 pixels. It taps into the grid system, and this ultimately uses space underneath the hood. So now I can use padding or margin or whatever it is from UI, and I can apply that same multiplier to the different sides that I need. If you do need 13 pixels for reasons, you can do that. Just give it a string, which is this is not different to how you would write CSS anyway. But if you wanted to tap into the space system, you could, or the grid system, you could, by giving it a raw number. Cool. So yeah, it's a whole thing about the UI thing and the grid system and presets and so on. It's kind of neat. So with all of that said, we have effectively explored a lot from here. We've touched upon the create styles, which is right here. The factory then builds it all. And the presets, which is UI, right? UI space, UI, whatever, it's all here. And we have our style system. Great. Awesome. The next system that is fundamental to how G2 works is the context system. And this system is unique to G2. I don't know of any other component library thing that kind of has something like this. Maybe Uber's base? I'm not too sure. But at least for how this works, this is very unique in the world of component libraries, and it's a unique thing for G2. So context, this is the thing that allows for the proposed integration into Gutenberg to work. All of this effectively rests on the fact that this context system exists, which is an understatement for how important this thing is. So what this is, you can imagine this is sort of like, I don't know, a social network or some sort of network thing. I'm going to draw like a little network guy. A little network with, sure, it's a network, yay. And every single component, every single G2 component at the moment, and this works for future components as well. By future components, I mean any component can be tapped into this thing. So every single one of these guys is tapped into this network. And this effectively allows this network to communicate with all of them. But because they're tapped into this network, these components also know how to communicate with each other if they need to, right? So because this one's effectively attached to something, like this one knows how to communicate with this one knows how to communicate with, they know how to communicate with each other. And I can show you where this is really, really, really important. Or I can show you where this is effective. So here we have accordions, right? And we have panels that kind of live inside. Where context is really important in terms of how code is kind of constructed, right, is if you're to take a look at how accordion components may look like in other libraries, so you can check out Chakra or any one of those, they typically kind of have their own accordion subcomponents, like accordion header, accordion body, accordion footer, blah, blah, blah. You have all those guys. But because panels are a thing within Gutenberg and within G2, and they're effectively like 99% the UI that we would like for accordions, then let's just put panels inside, right? So now panels, because of context, they are aware when they are inside of accordions. And when they are, they know how to behave in a way that is what you'd expect from accordions, which is only show one open at a time. And that's how that works. And we're able to have this because of context. Otherwise, you as the consumer, you as a developer, the poor developer that has to rig this thing up, if this didn't exist, then you would probably have to have some sort of state management thingy. You'd have to like figure this out on your own, right? Let's say, I don't know, ID is 1 or whatever the case may be. And it's up to you to tap into like callbacks or whatever to update this state. And then you pass in like visible is whatever state. And then you'd have to like do this dance with all these things to just rig up this component. And that's something I've noticed increasingly within component libraries. And it's something that I don't really agree with, just because it makes it more difficult for the user. It makes it more difficult for the developer, the consumer, whoever the case may be. Like, these things should feel magical. Developer or like designers, a good litmus test is designers should be able to prototype and rig these things up. Like non-hardcore React people should be able to use this stuff to build something cool. And the more you're pushing onto the user in terms of state management and all that stuff, that's more they have to take on in order to rig things up. So by default, G2, all of these components are controlled. What I mean by controlled is they know how to handle internal state and accept external state, and they know how to kind of do that dance. And that dance, by the way, is super complex. So by default, G2 components know how to they do that for you. But anywho, context, super important to allow something like this to work. Another area where context is important, and this is more recently, is this button group. So, I mean, we have buttons, right? Buttons are things you can click. And you click them and they do things. Click, 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 click. But the moment they render within a button group, like so, button group. Come on. I can't type. Type. Right. So the moment you do that, they assume the role of effectively a radio group. Like the actual radios, the HTML little dots. But the UI has changed to buttons. And the reason why they have radio groups is because from an accessibility and semantic standpoint, that's what this should be. But when buttons render within a when buttons render within a button group, they automatically know how to do that. And they also automatically know how to, if I press my keyboard, left and right and so on, they know how to adjust their state, and they know how to propagate state and all that kind of stuff. Things that buttons do not do by default. But because of context, they gain awareness, and this idea of awareness is very important. They gain awareness of where they are, and they adjust their behaviors automatically to accommodate that environment. And that with that stuff rigged automatically, right? That means that you as a user, the consumer, using these components, you don't have to do it, which is very, very important, and I think underestimated the power of that. So that's what context is. It allows for cross-component communication. And where this is also important is, well, now that we understand that we have some system where components can kind of communicate with each other, cool. The other thing that you can do with context is you can actually set up like areas, if that makes sense. So if I were to jump to my blog post over here, yeah, I had this analogy of like a power grid with homes and whatever. I don't know if that works very well, but that's the best I can come up with. Anywho, so imagine this with various UIs within Gutenberg, and these sections are areas that the context system is able to create. So what you can effectively do is you can say, oh, for the components that happen to render within this area, I need you to behave a little bit differently now. So instead of rendering pink, they'll render blue. Like so. And this can happen without you manually diving in and like fiddling with code and doing whatever. It's just if they happen to be in that area, their behavior will be adjusted. And this mechanic, right? The fact that you can fence off things and the fact that these components knows what that means, and the fact that you don't have to fiddle around with this guy in order for that to work, that is the fundamental mechanic that allows for this integration within Gutenberg to be successful. And that's all thanks to the context system here. Because it allows you to effectively create like as many areas as you want, right? And you can control them as much as you want. So it's like flipping a switch. It's like, oh, okay, for this area, let's flip a switch. Now all of this becomes that. This area, let's flip a switch so that all this becomes that. And you can incrementally control it, right? And without this setup, without this sort of like context connection kind of networky setup, you basically have no choice but to do blanket, like update all the buttons, update all the inputs, which is disastrous and is like, it changes a project from being you being able to deliver it within a couple of days to something that you have to take weeks to do, because you effectively have to go into every area that a button may be used and duct tape things to kind of make sure things don't break. But with this setup, you don't have to do that, because you can just like update, hey, I just want this one updated, and nothing else gets affected. So context, very, very important. And there is another system, I guess. Yeah, it's a system. This one also came a little bit later. Substate. Substate is the state management system that is used in many of the libraries within G2. So it's actually being used, it's actually lower level than create style, if you can imagine that. Create style is already pretty low level. Like at this point, you're almost working with the ones and zeros. But Substate is actually used inside of create style. It's also used inside of context. And it's used a bunch within components. So the strategy, the state management strategy of Substate is different compared to that of traditional React. By traditional React, I mean, if you were to look at state default out-of-the-box state management with React, you have either, jumping into here, you have either React use state, use context, or use reducer. Well, use context isn't, this is a so-so, like kinda, or I guess you can also use ref. If they aren't really state management-y, like these ones are so-so. Use ref is so-so, use context is so-so, but it's, yeah, you have either of these two. Use state or use reducer to manage your state. And effectively, anytime one of these things change, every component that lives within the area that where the state is being held. So let's say we have a div, and then we have all these divs that are nested, as with modern web development, I guess. Right. All right. Okay, we have lots of divs. Divs are great. Divs are wonderful. Okay. So let's say your state is somehow managed here. State is here. Then I'm going to turn on annotation tools. So what happens is every single time state is updated, unless you have memoization set up or whatever, it basically re-renders all that. So imagine if you had a value like position X or Y, or a background color, or something like something that's not super heavy computationally or anything. Just like I just have a background color. Every single time that changes, right? This whole thing, every single time, all this stuff needs to re-update, and it does that in kind of like one cycle. So that's mostly fine. But what's tricky though is depending on the kind of interactions you want to build. Let's pretend this is a state update, right? Sometimes you may need to intercept it to do something, and then if it doesn't work, you have to kind of revert it. Or you do something else. Or you do something else. And if it's good, then you kind of resume that. So this kind of looks like a person who's getting shot in the face. Let's just run with it. All right, so this person was shot in the face. Okay, so if your state is doing this with default use state is very, very hard. Not hard, but it gets very messy. Use reducer is kind of okay. It's better than use state, but still kind of messy. The substate strategy. Oh yeah, this stays on your screen. So the substate strategy, instead of using React's state thing, it uses something that's more in line with Redux. If you've used Redux before, it lets you create a store, and it uses a pub sub based model that basically is like anything. Let me just draw people. Hey, peoples, if you need to do something with this store data, go in, grab it from the store, and then adjust and do whatever it is you need. Right? This kind of state management approach is different compared to React. And where you can really see this coming to play within the context of G2 is the unit input. So the unit input, let me jump to this example. Yeah, sure. There's a lot of complexity. This is probably the most complex component within all of G2. It's funny because it's just an input, but don't underestimate inputs, because until the primary way we interact with computers is with voice or through our minds, we're going to be working with inputs and buttons a whole heck of a lot, because that's the fundamental way that we interact with computers, which makes sense as to why they can be so complex. So with this input, you can do a lot of different things. If I type in, say, 10%, and I press, oh, wait. Oh, it stopped working. How embarrassing. 10 EM? Oh, okay. Percents don't work for border button bottom width for reasons. I don't know. By the way, what you saw right there, why it didn't work, was because this actually has CSS CSS value validation. So I guess 10% isn't a valid value. But here you can see that after typing, say, 15 rem, the unit has been changed to rem, right? And if I were to type in something like hello, which is invalid CSS, it knows how to revert itself back to the previous value. And not only that, if I press up and down on my keyboard, it knows how to increment, and it knows how to decrement. If I hold shift, it knows how to jump, right? And lastly, last trick, rolls up my sleeves, you can click and drag this thing to jump it up and down as well. Holding shift will also do the shift jumping of like time 10 multiplier. But trying to do all that without this state management model is very, very, very hard. So the unit input thingy that exists within Gutenberg right now uses the more traditional React use reducer thing to try to handle this. And we've run into quite a few problems. My apologies. That was the first time I had to build a unit input. And when I tried to attempt to build it here within G2, I ran into basically the same problems until I did two things. One was I adopted the store-based state management strategy, and two, I used hook composition, which is a completely separate thing. But with that, a lot of interactions are able to kind of like coordinate and communicate between different parts, and data knows how to like flow through easily in a more fluid way. And we're able to get experiences like this, and it just works. It's very solid. It's hyper performant. And that's the other thing. This thing, Substate, because it uses this store-based pub subby model that kind of goes around React's kind of render cycle, it's super, super performant. And it's no surprise to me that something like this was developed, and this, by the way, is using Zustand underneath the hood. So it's no surprise to me that something as awesome and high performant as Zustand comes from the folks that have effectively created one of the best animation libraries that's available to React. The folks that are doing stuff in the animation world, library world, they have so much respect from me, because it's so complex. You think you know animations when you do things with CSS animations. No, there's a whole world of a thing that exists within the world of animation libraries. Um, but yeah, they need to do like hyper performance stuff. So if I were to jump into ZooStand right here, they have a really cool example. G2 does not use this particular technique, but this thing just shows how hyper performant it can be, which may be required for Gutenberg because ultimately, for this G2 stuff, I'm going to switch away from this for a second. For this G2 stuff, like, we want to provide richer experiences. Richer experiences may mean more animations, more complex UIs, more state handling, all that stuff. But like, we have to deliver it in a way that can render on people's computers, and that doesn't require them to have a $5,000 laptop to do it. So we should be able to deliver buttery smooth UI to Chromebooks and so on. And the only way to do that is to be very mindful of performance and to optimize that as best as you can at the lowest levels that you can. That is at the animation system level or the UI component library level or whatever the case may be. And as we want to build richer and richer experiences with Gutenberg, so things like in-canvas manipulation, maybe, where you have layers or you can like drag to resize and do all that kind of stuff, which is very kind of graphically intensive in terms of like, how do I render all this stuff with JavaScript? The systems that you have in place in terms of gestures, animation, they have to be as fast. They have to be Sonic the Hedgehog fast, right? So yeah, this is a very quick demonstration of how fast ZooStand can be. So right now, it's able to do all this fiddly bits with 60 frames a second. But if you were to use default React state management, this is the frame rate you get. 15, 16, whatever, super janky on my very expensive laptop. We shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to have an expensive computer to have nice experiences. So I think being very mindful of that and optimizing that at a super low level is important, and doing it in a way that is invisible, seamless to developers and consumers that may be using some of these components or some of these parts to construct their UIs and their experiences. That is key. So that is what Substate is. Substate is the component library optimized state management system that's used within the core systems of G2. Create styles, context. And with this very kind of messy map, we now kind of have a fundamental understanding of the core and important systems that basically create what G2 component is. The only one I kind of left out is a package called utils. Utils isn't really a system. It's just a collection of, well, utilities. But I would say do not underestimate the usefulness and the power of these utilities. Because, man, if you thought Substate was low level, utils also powers everything. Utils powers styles, powers create styles, it powers context, it powers components. It's everywhere. Utils is everywhere. And there's basic things in there like type checking, like, are you a string? Are you a number? Things like that. They're inside of utils, and this is important. So, for example, like, there are so many different ways to check if a value is a number within JavaScript. You can do like this. I don't know. Right? It's like, sure, some people may do that, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Oh, so that does work. There's some values that is just like it does not work anymore. I can't remember. Oh, maybe they improved it. I don't know. Is nan 0? Is not a number 0 false? I'm confused now. I don't know. There's some edge cases I know of, especially when it came down to unit handling here. This stuff, man, because 210 rem, it's a string, so you have to split that. So now 210 rem become this, and then you need to do something with this to pass into something else, and then so on, and then this kind of deconstruction thing has to be reversed when you want to pass a value back into whatever that consumes it. Anywho, for this particular thing of unit handling, there could be so many variations of what these values are. Whether it's a 0, and if it's 0, if it's like a string or a number or whatever the case may be. Having some of those types being checked. So in the case of G2, we have something called is numeric. By passing something into numeric, you can be a string or you can be a number. Either one, it's fine. Like it'll tell you if the thing is a number or not. And there's something called numeric 0, I believe. It's so dumb. It's so primitive, right? Like, is this thing a 0 or are you a 0 string? Which is important for certain use cases. But by having a utility like this, it makes it so much easier to read and write code, right? Because I've noticed this a lot in G2 inside of Gutenberg, where you do something like this: is type equals undefined or whatever. So if you can just do this as undefined thing, it's just nicer to read. And that's the main thing about code. It's you write for other humans to read, right? So having some utilities like this is very important, is helpful. That aside, there are some other utilities that are important, and the reason why they should kind of exist inside of a generic package like utilities is because it allows you to use them in many different places of the code. So unit parsing, for example, right? Like, are you a unit? If so, how do you splitting the units and exploding it and combining it and blah, 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 all that stuff. Like, we have to do that for typography tools. Typography tools, where are you? Nope, typo. Yeah. There we go. So for this slider it doesn't know how to understand units. Like it can't show a PX or anything. So, but it has to accept incoming unit values, right? Because size, this input, and this slider, they're bound to the same value. They're bound to 54px. So when 54px goes inside of input, it knows how to handle that. When it goes inside a slider, it knows how to handle that. And the moment I change the slider to something else like 66px, the value has to then be massaged back into something to like send up to be like, oh, the change is 66px. Yeah, so little utilities for unit parsing and understanding and doing all that kind of stuff. It's helpful that it's available in sort of this general utilities package so that you can use them in places you need them to be used, like slider or text input or whatever the case may be. So yeah, do not underestimate the usefulness and the power of a generic kind of effectively a drawer where you put a bunch of your tools and things. You know, in your house, you always have that drawer where like you just put vague things. That messy drawer where you put like batteries and whatever, I don't know, some other stuff in there that you think you'll need. That's kind of what units Sorry, that's kind of what utils is, but it's actually very, very, very useful. One of my favorite utilities. Man, I think I have a directory called Math Interpolate. I actually wrote a blog post about this. Components Interpolate. Yeah. So interpolation is cool. It's a utility that basically you give it a value and you give it a range, the incoming range, and then some sort of output range, and then it now becomes something else. So with interpolation, why it's so powerful and why it's so cool is you can be like, literally in this example, the current value is 10. The minimum the number can be is 0. The maximum it can be is 200, right? And I want you to map 0 to be blue and 200 to be red. So wherever it is, the value is right now, give me that color. So with Interpolate, you're able to basically translate a numeric value, which is, say, 100, into a number value given a mixed color value given a range. That's nuts. Like the math behind that, I don't understand it, but that's nuts. So you're able to do some funky stuff like this. Or you can apply that to some other things like transforms and scales. So you can do a lot of things like this. And by the way, like a lot of the mobile experiences that we've now come to enjoy on various applications we have in our iPhones and Androids, they use animation interpolation for a lot of their stuff. Like when headers need to animate, or if you're inside of Twitter or something, you're pulling down to refresh and the background cover just like grows and shrinks based on how much you pulled down. Yeah, you're mapping the size of something based on how much you've pulled down. And there is like a tapered threshold for like how much you pull and how the size grows. Math. I don't know. Math happens and you get this really nice experience. But like, yeah, utils is useful because then you can collect some of these math functions in a folder called math, and you have access to this in whatever kind of experience you want to build. And that's what utils is. That's a long little thing about what utils is and why it's important. And I think like basically if you take a look at the code of any kind of project, library project, they'll probably have a utils folder, that catch-all folder that does things. So if I were to jump into ReaKit, and this is not a criticism to you, Diego and friends. I love ReaKit. This is just yeah, ReaKit has utils as well. What kind of utils? Oh man, yeah. Like some of their utils they're pretty nuts. And I know I've spoken to Diego. He wants this stuff to be like dependency free, library free. He wants everything to kind of come within the ReaKit ecosystem, which is very admirable. Yeah, there are just things that you just have to do, like finding the closest DOM node, or checking if some DOM element has focus, or doing stuff with objects and arrays and doing whatever, I don't know, things with data. Utils is useful for that. So, with all that being said, and the handful of tangents that I've went into, I think, hopefully, we now have a better understanding of all the systems, the subsystems and so on, that is required to powering the experience we want for G2 components. We need, well, at the very base level, we need utilities that then, let me change it to blue. We need utilities that have a collection of useful, reusable functions, low-level things that can be used in many places of the code base. We have our custom style system creator function thing that ultimately is powered by emotion, but does some fancy things underneath the hood that custom tailors the style experience for WordPress and WordPress and Gutenberg. We have the actual style system, which has a collection of presets and mixins and so on that enhances the experience of creating richer experiences and richer UIs for G2 or for Gutenberg, which is here. We have a component library optimized state management library engine thingy that optimizes for performance from as low as a level as you can get for not only the components, but then also for the style system. And last but not least, we have our context system, the network that allows many of the components to communicate with each other so that they understand what environment they're in so that they can then adjust their behaviors accordingly. And that allows for a much cleaner way of writing code with G2. Not only that, but context is the fundamental thing that allows us to strategically integrate G2 into Gutenberg in a way that is almost that we're trying to be as least disruptive as possible to the current code base and to the code that is incoming from third-party developers. We don't want them to do a code freeze in order for us to update to G2. They should not be aware that we're doing all this stuff underneath the hood. It's just one day, bam, they just have nicer UI and it's great. In theory. Context gives us that control to do that. So with utils, styles, substate, and create styles and context, these are the many systems that power G2. And yeah, this was the kind of rambly, kind of hopefully not too all over the place video that describes kind of in detail, depending on the library I'm talking about, describes in detail the systems that's required for this very unique, very fun component experience we have for Gutenberg. And with that, hopefully this was useful. And I think I might, if I can figure out how to do this, I'll try to download this video from Twitch and re-upload it to YouTube, just in case, just to make it a little bit more accessible to folks. And with that, please, I guess, pay attention still to the G2 Components blog. So that's g2components.wordpress.com. This is where I share a lot of the updates in written form. And I have these Twitch streams almost basically every single day, usually in the mornings where I do something. I usually code something or design something. In this particular case, I'm just talking about stuff. And yeah, there's the GitHub repo. There's my Twitch thingy. There is this G2 Components WordPress blog. And all of the planning, all the planning and the coordination work for preparing G2 to be integrated into Gutenberg. If you want to, you can take a look at this Miro board, which is Miro, which you can get from this Gutenberg integration typography blog post here. There's a link all the way down here that'll bring you here. Yeah, so this is what I'm going to be using to track the progress for where we're at in terms of this integration stuff. And with that, thank you so much for your time today. It's been 2 hours. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope you had a fantastic day, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. This has been Q. You've been wonderful, and I'll catch you another time. Take care. Bye.